I'm Buffy, the Vampire Slayer, and you are?
These videos are not for children. If you are a children, then piss off.
Hey there, I'm Infuso. And I'm pretty sure I've talked before, albeit briefly, on my love for Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So yeah, guess what? I'm gonna do it again. And probably a couple more times after this video too. It is one of my all-time favorite shows that wound up spinning off my actual all-time favorite show, Angel. The series kickstarted what has been affectionately known as the Buffyverse, existing in a universe much similar to ours, but with the seedy underground of vampires, werewolves, demons, and everything else in between. The show is about the chosen girl gifted with superhuman strength, fulfilling her destiny of killing all vampires, all while juggling her own real-life teenage drama and growing pains. And despite the fact that it spawned plenty of projects similar to, or at least inspired by it, it is still to this day in a league of its own. The show truly is one of a kind. And yes, while it did have that one successful spin-off that I've previously mentioned, it had many more unsuccessful ones that you've probably either completely forgot about or you never even knew existed to begin with. And today, I'm here to give you a sneak peek at what could have been. Because there were a lot of projects for this show that were rumored, spoken of, confirmed, and some that even briefly went into development. But ultimately, nothing came of any of these. So let's get into it. During the last season of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, many other potential Slayers were brought in to be taught under the tutelage of Slayers Buffy and Fate, which was a story I personally wasn't all that big of a fan of. Like, I like the concept, and on paper it sounds like something I would really like. It sounds great. But in execution, not great. Not so great. I feel like the Potentials did little more than take up valuable screen time in the show's last hurrah. It just seemed like they were put into the last season, so then this way when they did the big final battle, there could be more stuff going on in the background. And that just made the potential Slayers' collective existence seem really cheap. Their personalities never really got fleshed out, and we never got a real idea for who most of these characters were as people. And the very few that did were some of the worst, or at the very least, the weakest characters written into the show. I'm looking at you, Kennedy. Just thinking you could come up in here and replace Tara like that? Not on my watch.
Not up in here.
Not up in here!
I ain't having any of that.
How dare you stand where he stood?
Maybe these characters would have been fleshed out more in the proposed Buffy spin-off, Slayer School. This sequel series would feature and star the supporting Slayers from the previous season of Buffy in lead roles. It would also showcase some of Buffy's main cast as bit players in supporting roles. Luckily, cooler heads prevailed, and Josh eventually decided against it, stating that something about it just didn't feel right. And I personally think that was the right call. I'm not sure that this was a concept that Buffy fans would be able to rally behind, and it really could have hurt the brand overall. Having a bunch of bland Slayers in training whose faces your audience only vaguely recalls as a selling point, when your former major players sat idly by in the background, it just doesn't sound like a sound idea. It didn't work for Scrubs, it wouldn't work for Buffy. I said what I said. There was also another proposed spin-off of Buffy following its last season, that being Faith the Vampire Slayer. A series that would follow the finale of Buffy with a redeemed Faith on her new path. And from what I can tell, things were actually moving forward with this spin-off. I remember it being reported around the time that Buffy went off the air that this show was going to be starting up. This was going to be a thing. There were a lot of whispers about it, but you know, like whispers in movies, like you could very audibly hear them. But ultimately, plans for the show were scrapped when Faith actress Elijah Dushku moved on and took on a role in the show True Calling. She claims that she took this role because she felt that the show was just being made to cash in and continue the Buffy legacy, and she didn't really know if she was up for doing that. She was smart enough to know that the show would inevitably be compared to its predecessor, and she just didn't know if it could measure up, which is beyond understandable. I personally think it would have been a little hard to get into another Vampire Slayer show directly after the most definitive Vampire Slayer show just came to an end. If you were gonna spin a character off of the show, it should probably be someone who's substantially different from your lead, but was still around long enough for recognition and was able to build up enough love from the audience to hold their own in series. I think this was the right call. Like if they put me in charge, I would have probably tried to make a Willow series, because she's different enough from Buffy, both in terms of what she brings to the table and her personality, but she was around long enough on Buffy that everybody knows her, and she's a fan favorite of the show. The actress also wanted to move on from the Faith character and try new endeavors, after having played the character and developed her for half a decade. Regardless, the idea for a Faith-led series would come to fruition years later, when she got her very own comic book series. And this series took a lot of the concepts they originally had for the potential show and reincorporated them into its new continuity. There was also allegedly supposed to be a Faith movie at one point in time, which similarly didn't get made, and there's next to nothing known about this project. Speaking of movies, following the end of Buffy's sister show, Angel, there was a lot of talks of an Angel movie, something I myself could get very much on board with. The WB was interested in producing said movie, but star David Boreanaz claimed that he'd only reprise the role if it were to make its way into movie theaters. So that was a no-go. And besides, at this point in time, the guy was probably far too busy playing Leon in Kingdom Hearts. The next idea that was brought up was to make a WB-made Spike movie. Another idea that I could very much get on board with. The idea was toyed with for a couple years. Spike actor James Marsters loved portraying the character, and was more than just a little interested in expanding the legacy of this character. He remained interested for 7 years following the close of Angel, as he felt within that time frame he could very well reasonably portray an unaging vampire. Apparently, he's since added that he'd still love to play the role again, but there can't be any quote-unquote cheating. And he would only do it now if the technology is able to realistically digitally de-age him. Marsters was also working closely with Josh in the creative department for this movie, and had a fair amount of input. He'd even helped work on a draft of the script. The story would consist of a now homeless and re-ensouled Spike, who would live his life on the streets, struggling with his newfound humanity. The movie would also star Amy Acker returning as Illyria, and Allison Hannigan coming back as Willow. In a surprising turn of events, J. August Richards would also return as Gunn, who would now be the big bad after having been turned into a vampire in the final battle of Angel. Though I can't specifically remember if that would have been done by Angel or Spike to save him, or if it was done by any of the vampires that were in the final battle, because, you know, they were hungry and just wanted to grab a bite. But I think it would have been interesting seeing a beloved character like Gunn suddenly turn to the dark side. The project was continually delayed due to the actors and most notably Joss Whedon moving on to other projects, which kinda left it in developmental hell until both Amy Acker and James Marsters stated that the project was more than likely not going to be made. Much like Faith, the concepts for a Spike follow-up were repurposed in the Spike comic book series, as the graphic novel actually is almost a complete recreation of the plot that was proposed for this TV movie. Other ideas that would have been used exclusively for the movie would also go on to be repurposed for the Angel After the Fall comic book series, including Spike's relationship with Illyria, and Gunn being a vampiric villain. Any true Buffy diehard fan would be able to tell you that Giles was a bit of a badass before he settled down and became your ordinary watcher/school librarian. He was once known as Ripper, a man who had an in with the occult, and he was kind of your standard Sid Vicious type. I think out of all the projects that were supposed to follow Buffy and Angel, this is one of the most confusing, because I think it went through several different drafts and versions. Because I recall hearing so many different things about it that just don't add up. I remember hearing that it was set to be a miniseries that would air on the BBC, but I also remember hearing it was originally planned as a one-off movie or a straight-to-DVD video. So, you know, who really knows for sure? It just kind of seems like a bunch of things were thrown at the wall and just none of them were sticking. They were clearly exhausting a lot of different possibilities, and me trying to keep up with all of them. The series would have taken place directly after Buffy, with Anthony Stewart Head returning as Giles. It would have showed the Giles character returning home to England following the events of the last season, where he's now lonely and depressed. He has no real path or purpose in life anymore. He led the Slayer to her destiny, and now he's just alone. Which could have been an interesting development for Giles. The plot would apparently focus more heavily on ghosts than anything else, which was a bit different from your Demon of the Week theme its predecessor shows had. Head referred to the Ripper Project as beautiful, and was looking forward to trying to piece together the next chapter in Giles' overall journey. But it just never came to be. Apparently Joss Whedon got too tied up with the Buffy Season 8 comic, and with his new show at the time, Dollhouse, which, side note, I've actually never watched, but I do intend on doing that one day, probably for this channel. A show which also starred Elijah Dushku. And if that wasn't enough, Whedon also apparently had a contractual issue with the Ripper character, and the whole thing just fell by the wayside, which is kind of unfortunate. Like almost everything else that's been mentioned on this list, the concept was repurposed for the comic Angel and Faith, where Giles' backstory is shown in detail, and several characters who were intended to appear in the show, thing, were introduced in the panels. Another interesting side note here is that in the story, Giles has two witch aunts who don't age, who were originally intended to be played in the show, project, by Anthony Stewart Head's daughters. It's sad that didn't happen. And last but not least is Buffy the Animated Series, a show that actually made progress in its production. Development for the show began almost immediately after Buffy ended, with almost all of the main cast and the supporting cast returning to reprise their roles, with the exception of Sarah Michelle Gellar, who chose not to return to the series. But outside of her, they had everybody. Allison Hannigan, Nicholas Brendan, Anthony Stewart Head, Charisma Carpenter, David Boreanaz, Christine Sutherland, Armin Shimmerman, I'm not saying that one right, probably. Replacing Gellar would have been Giselle Lauren, who'd already portrayed Buffy in the video game Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Chaos Bleeds. And I gotta hand it to her, the girl has one hell of a Sarah Michelle Gellar impersonation. I can just barely tell the difference between the two. Strangely enough, this wouldn't exactly be a continuation of the show as everything else I've previously mentioned, as it wouldn't take place following the events of the finale, but instead would take place during the course of season 1 of the series. Even more strange is that Michelle Trachtenberg,
Here's some information.
Alright, well, you know what? If Siri recognizes her name as that, then I'm gonna say it as that. It's probably wrong. Obviously, I'm talking about Harriet the Spy here, guys, alright? You know who I'm saying. She was set to reprise her role as Dawn Summers, despite Dawn not appearing or technically even being created until Buffy Season 5. So I don't know how that would work, but I would be interested in finding out. 8 episodes were planned, but only one 4-minute test pilot was made to pitch to networks. But it just didn't seem to pick up, which is a damn shame, because I would have watched the hell out of this show. Though thinking about it in hindsight, it would have been strange seeing a series that took place within the first season of a show, because then it seems like anything that happened during the animated series must not have been all that important. It must have all been minor, as it was never referenced or brought up during the actual events of the show, and it probably would have felt really out of place with the rest of the overall continuity. The animated style and the design of the characters would once again, surprise surprise, be reused in one of the Buffy the Vampire Slayer comics, because of course it was. But I gotta say, I actually really appreciate that while none of these ideas ever made it to the big or small screen, they were at least repurposed and we still got to see them play out. And it kind of gives us an insight as to what could have been. I guess technically what is, because it's still supposed to be part of its continuity. Although now I hear they might make a Buffy Season 8, and it's weird because there already is a Buffy Season 8, so I guess that continuity doesn't mean anything anymore, but you know, I digress. I digress. Speaking on my own behalf, I am a huge fan of the Angel After the Fall comics, as well as all the development the Spike character gets in that, and I kind of wish we would have gotten to see what it would have looked like in live action. But regardless, I'm glad these ideas do still exist in some manner, and they still contribute to the overall continuity of the Buffyverse. So contributing Vgenerates, let me know in the comments section below which of these spin-offs you personally would have looked forward to the most, and which you're the most upset didn't get made. So that's all for today, guys, and I hope to catch you in the next one.
I'm the Clown Prince of Crime, and that was the Prince of Personality, the Infuso, or so he says. So if you like the words that came out of his mouth hole and you too want to become a V-tard, don't forget to like and subscribe. Follow the man on Twitter, because it's not stalking if it's on the internet after all. Join the fun by joining the Discord. If for some strange reason you want to show support, and I don't know why you would, and if you have $1 to spare, head over to the SIJW's Patreon, where you can request videos, get exclusive content, and early access to scheduled videos. Or head to his PayPal, where you can buy the shirts. Oh, aren't those lovely? And just remember, if you're not tuning in, you're missing out. Yeah.